In the autumn of 1932, the isolated mountain valleys of rural West Virginia whispered about the Calderón Sisters, three women who had shared their father as their husband and created a horrific lineage that would poison their bloodline for generations. The sisters, Esperanza, Dolores, and Caridad, had lived in complete isolation on their family's sprawling homestead for over 2 decades, bearing children to their own father, Vicente Calderón, in a twisted interpretation of keeping their bloodline pure. What began as their father's obsession with maintaining family land and legacy had devolved into something far more sinister. When the youngest sister, Caridad, began having prophetic nightmares about deformed children crawling from the earth, and her own offspring displayed increasingly disturbing physical and mental abnormalities, the family's isolation could no longer contain their dark secret. A visiting census worker would discover the truth, a traveling doctor would document the medical horrors, and by winter, the Calderón bloodline would face a reckoning that would expose 3 generations of genetic devastation hidden in the Appalachian wilderness. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. These stories happened in communities just like yours, closer to home than you might think. Perhaps we will uncover a story there. The autumn mist clung to the Appalachian valleys of West Virginia like a shroud, obscuring the winding dirt road that led to places most people preferred to forget. Thomas Chen adjusted his leather satchel and checked his pocket watch as his Model A Ford climbed the treacherous mountain path. As a census worker for the federal government, he had seen his share of remote communities during the Great Depression, but nothing quite like the isolated hollow that stretched before him. The year 1932 had brought desperate times to rural America, and the government's expansion programs were reaching into previously forgotten corners of the country. Thomas had been assigned to conduct a comprehensive population count in the most remote areas of the West Virginia mountains, places where families had lived in complete isolation for generations. His methodical nature and attention to detail made him perfect for the job, though his colleagues often wondered why anyone would volunteer for such thankless work in such forbidding territory. The valley he entered seemed frozen in time. Dense forests of oak and pine pressed in from all sides, creating a natural barrier that had kept the outside world at bay for decades. The single dirt road, barely wide enough for his automobile, showed signs of recent maintenance despite the area's reputation for abandonment. Carved wooden posts marked property boundaries, their weathered surfaces bearing symbols and words in what appeared to be Spanish. Thomas consulted his census records as he drove deeper into the valley. According to the official documentation, 12 people resided at the Calderón homestead, though previous census forms from 1920 and 1910 showed only 3 adult signatures. The discrepancy had caught the attention of his supervisors in Charleston, who insisted that a thorough investigation was warranted. Rural families often kept poor records, but such a significant variance demanded explanation. The homestead itself appeared gradually through the morning fog, a sprawling collection of buildings that suggested both prosperity and peculiar isolation. The main house, built in the Spanish colonial style unusual for this region, dominated a cleared area of perhaps 50 acres. Outbuildings included a large barn, several smaller structures, and what appeared to be workers' quarters, though no workers were visible anywhere on the property. Most striking was the elaborate cemetery that occupied a prominent hillside position, its numerous headstones and markers indicating a family history stretching back several generations. Thomas parked his automobile at the ornate iron gate that blocked the main entrance to the property. The metalwork was exceptional, featuring intricate designs that spoke of both artistry and expense. Signs in multiple languages warned visitors away, though the English version simply read, "Private property, no trespassing, Calderón family." He retrieved his official credentials and approached the gate, noting the heavy chain and padlock that secured it. Before he could announce his presence, A figure emerged from behind one of the outbuildings. The woman appeared to be in her 30s, dressed in clothing that seemed decades out of fashion. Her long black hair was braided simply, and her dark eyes held an expression of profound wariness as she approached the gate from the inside. She moved with a curious gait, as if unused to encountering strangers, and Thomas noticed that she kept a considerable distance between herself and the fence. "Good morning," Thomas called out, holding up his government identification. "I'm Thomas Chen with the United States Census Bureau. I need to speak with someone about updating your family's population records." The woman stopped abruptly, her eyes widening with what appeared to be genuine fear. She spoke rapidly in Spanish, shaking her head emphatically, before turning and hurrying back toward the main house. Thomas waited several minutes, hoping someone else might appear, but the property remained eerily quiet except for the occasional lowing of cattle from somewhere beyond his view. Frustrated but not deterred, Thomas made careful notes about his initial contact attempt. The woman's reaction struck him as excessive even for families known to be suspicious of government officials. During the Depression, many rural people had good reason to distrust federal representatives, but her terror seemed rooted in something deeper than mere anti-government sentiment. He decided to drive back to the nearest town, a small community called Cedar Grove situated 15 miles away down the winding mountain road. The general store there would likely provide information about the Calderón family and their reputation in the area. Local knowledge often proved invaluable when dealing with reclusive families who had little contact with the outside world. Cedar Grove consisted of fewer than 24 buildings clustered around a single main street. The general store occupied the most prominent position, its weathered sign advertising supplies, postal services, and local information. Thomas parked outside and entered the dim interior, where shelves lined with goods created narrow aisles that led to a counter dominated by an elderly man with suspicious eyes. "You're not from around here," the storekeeper observed, sizing up Thomas's city clothes and official bearing. "Government man, I'd guess." "Census Bureau," Thomas confirmed, showing his credentials. "I'm trying to locate the Calderón family for population verification. They live up in the valley about 15 miles north." The change in the storekeeper's expression was immediate and unmistakable. His face grew pale, and he glanced quickly toward the other customers browsing the store before leaning closer to Thomas across the counter. "The old Spanish place," he whispered. "Mister, you don't want to go bothering those folks. They keep to themselves, and there's good reason for it." Dr. Margaret Hayes had been practicing medicine for 15 years, but the traveling clinic she established in the remote areas of West Virginia presented challenges unlike any she had encountered in more civilized regions. Her modified truck, equipped with basic medical supplies and examination equipment, had become a familiar sight along the mountain roads as she brought healthcare to families who might otherwise go years without seeing a physician. The autumn of 1932 found her particularly busy, as economic hardship had made medical care even more inaccessible to rural families. Children suffered from malnutrition, preventable diseases, and conditions that would be easily treatable in urban areas. Dr. Hayes took meticulous notes on every patient, not only for medical purposes, but also to document the health crisis facing these isolated communities. Her first encounter with what she would later recognize as the Calderón situation occurred on a crisp October morning, when she set up her mobile clinic in the town square of Cedar Grove. Word spread quickly through the small community that a doctor was available, and families began arriving with children who had been suffering in silence for months or even years. Among the early patients was a boy of perhaps 8 years old, brought by a nervous woman who identified herself only as his aunt. The child displayed several concerning physical characteristics that immediately caught Dr. Hayes's attention. His facial structure showed distinct abnormalities, including a severely protruding lower jaw and unusually small eyes set too close together. More troubling was his apparent intellectual disability, as he seemed unable to respond to simple questions or follow basic instructions. "Where does this child live?" Dr. Hayes asked gently, making notes in her medical journal. The woman shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if checking to see who might overhear their conversation. "Up in the mountains," she replied vaguely. "His family don't come to town much." Dr. Hayes pressed for more specific information, explaining that she might be able to provide follow-up care or connect the family with additional resources. The woman became increasingly agitated, eventually gathering the child and leaving abruptly without providing any useful details about their location or circumstances. 3 days later, another child appeared with strikingly similar physical characteristics and developmental delays. This time, the adult accompanying the child was an elderly man who claimed to be transporting the patient on behalf of distant relatives. Again, the family's location remained mysteriously vague, described only as somewhere in the remote mountain valleys. By the end of her week in Cedar Grove, Dr. Hayes had encountered 7 children who shared remarkably similar genetic abnormalities. All displayed the same distinctive facial deformities, intellectual disabilities, and physical developmental problems. Most concerning was the fact that none of the adults bringing these children seemed to be their actual parents, and all were evasive about the children's family circumstances and living conditions. Her medical training told her that such a concentration of similar genetic disorders in a small geographic area was highly unusual and potentially significant. Individual cases of birth defects occurred randomly throughout any population, but finding multiple children with identical abnormalities suggested either environmental factors or genetic conditions within a closely related family group. Dr. Hayes decided to extend her stay in the area and began making discreet inquiries about families with large numbers of children living in the most isolated parts of the mountains. Her questions yielded frustrating results, as local residents seemed reluctant to discuss certain families or specific locations. She noticed that mention of the northern valleys, where the most isolated homesteads were located, produced particular discomfort among the townspeople. The breakthrough came when she approached Martha Whitfield, an experienced midwife who had served the mountain communities for over 30 years. Martha initially proved as reluctant as everyone else to discuss certain families, but Dr. Hayes's medical credentials and genuine concern for the children's welfare eventually overcame her reservations. "There's a place up north," Martha said quietly, checking to ensure they were not overheard. "Big spread, been in the same family for decades. I used to go there years back when they called for help with births." Dr. Hayes encouraged her to continue, sensing that this information might be crucial to understanding the pattern she had observed. "Strangest thing I ever saw in all my years," Martha continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Too many babies for the number of women in that house. And the babies, Lord help them, they weren't right. Most didn't live past their first year." Martha described visiting the homestead perhaps a dozen times over the years, always under unusual circumstances. The family insisted on complete secrecy about her visits, paying her well but demanding that she never discuss what she witnessed there. The number of children she helped deliver far exceeded what should have been possible given the household composition, and many of the infants showed severe abnormalities that made survival unlikely. "I stopped going there around 1925, Martha concluded. "Couldn't stand to see any more of those poor babies. Whatever's happening in that place, it ain't natural." Dr. Hayes pressed for the location of this mysterious homestead, but Martha would only say that it lay somewhere in the northern valley, accessible by a single mountain road. She described seeing multiple generations living together in ways that struck her as unusual, though she remained vague about the specific family dynamics that had troubled her so deeply. Armed with this new information, Dr. Hayes began to piece together a disturbing picture. The children she had examined likely came from this isolated homestead, and their similar genetic abnormalities suggested severe inbreeding within a single family line. Such genetic problems typically resulted from marriages between close relatives over multiple generations, creating a concentration of harmful recessive traits. The medical implications were staggering, but the human tragedy was even more profound. The monthly supply run into Cedar Grove had become a ritual for Esperanza Calderón, though one she approached with increasing dread as the years passed. On the third Tuesday of October 1932, she hitched the wagon to their strongest horse and began the familiar journey down the mountain road, her stomach tight with the familiar anxiety that accompanied any contact with the outside world. At 34, Esperanza was the eldest of the three sisters and bore the responsibility of maintaining what little connection their family maintained with the broader community. Her father had designated her as the family's representative years ago, though she approached the role with none of the confidence he expected from her. The weight of maintaining their carefully constructed secrecy had worn on her nerves until even simple tasks like purchasing supplies had become ordeals of fear and suspicion. The general store in Cedar Grove remained much as it had been throughout her adult life, with the same weathered proprietor behind the counter and the same suspicious glances from townspeople who regarded her as an oddity from the mysterious Spanish settlement in the northern valley. Esperanza had learned to move quickly and efficiently through her purchases, speaking as little as possible and avoiding eye contact that might encourage unwanted conversation. Her shopping list included the usual staples: flour, sugar, coffee, and various household necessities that the family could not produce on their isolated homestead. More recently, however, the list had grown to include increasing quantities of medical supplies and children's clothing, purchases that required careful explanation should anyone notice the unusual patterns in her buying habits. As she gathered items from the store's shelves, Esperanza became aware of a man observing her movements with particular attention. Unlike the usual casual curiosity of small-town residents, his interest seemed professional and systematic. When she approached the counter with her purchases, he positioned himself nearby, clearly hoping to overhear her conversation with the storekeeper. The stranger was Asian, well-dressed in city clothes that marked him as an outsider to the mountain community. He carried himself with the bearing of an educated man, and his careful observation suggested official business rather than mere curiosity about the local inhabitants. Esperanza's father had warned her repeatedly about such men, government representatives who might bring unwanted attention to their family's private affairs. "Morning, Miss Calderón," the storekeeper greeted her, beginning to tally her purchases. "Quite a list today. You folks planning for a hard winter?" Esperanza nodded silently, counting out the payment in old silver coins that had become her family's preferred currency. The coins themselves often drew attention, as most families in the area had long since spent their silver during the economic hardships of recent years. Her father had accumulated substantial precious metal reserves during the family's decades of isolation, providing them with purchasing power even as their neighbors struggled with poverty. The stranger moved closer, and Esperanza sensed his increased attention to her transaction. She fumbled with the coins, dropping several on the floor in her nervousness. As she knelt to retrieve them, the man spoke directly to her for the first time. "Excuse me, miss. I'm Thomas Chen with the United States Census Bureau. I've been trying to contact your family about updating population records for your area." The blood drained from Esperanza's face as she straightened up, the fallen coins still scattered at her feet. Census records represented exactly the kind of government scrutiny that her father had spent decades avoiding. Their family's survival depended on maintaining complete privacy about their living arrangements and the true nature of their household composition. "I don't know what you mean," she stammered, backing away from the counter and leaving her purchases behind. "I have to go." Thomas Chen reached into his jacket for what she assumed were official documents, but Esperanza had already turned toward the door. Her father's instructions had been clear and absolute. Under no circumstances should she engage with government officials or provide any information about their family's private affairs. The consequences of discovery, he had warned her repeatedly, would be catastrophic for everyone living on their homestead. She fled the store without completing her purchases, leaving behind not only the supplies but also the silver coins she had dropped in her panic. The wagon horses sensed her distress as she climbed onto the driver's seat with shaking hands, and they responded to her urgent commands by moving quickly toward the mountain road that led home. Behind her, Thomas Chen emerged from the store and watched her departure with growing certainty that the Calderón family was hiding something significant. Her reaction to his simple introduction had been far more extreme than warranted by normal suspicion of government officials. Rural families might be wary of census workers, but they rarely fled in terror from basic questions about household composition. The storekeeper approached Thomas, holding the scattered silver coins that Esperanza had abandoned in her haste to escape. "She's never acted like that before," he observed, examining the old Spanish colonial currency. "Nervous woman, but usually polite enough. You really spooked her with that census talk." Thomas accepted the coins, noting their age and probable value. "How long has she been coming here for supplies?" "Must be 20 years or more. Always the same routine, always pays in old silver like this. Buys for a big household, judging by the quantities, but never talks about family matters. Her sisters come with her sometimes, but they're even quieter than she is." The information confirmed Thomas's suspicions about the discrepancies in the census records. A household large enough to require substantial monthly supplies, but represented by only 3 adult signatures, suggested either additional residents being concealed or some other irregularity in the family's legal status. As Esperanza's wagon disappeared around a bend in the mountain road, Thomas made detailed notes about the encounter and began planning his next approach to the mysterious Calderón family. The courthouse in Cedar Grove occupied a modest brick building that served multiple governmental functions for the surrounding mountain communities. Thomas Chen spent the following morning examining public records that might shed light on the mysterious Calderón family and their apparent reluctance to participate in the federal census. His experience with rural populations had taught him that official documentation often revealed discrepancies that families preferred to keep private. The marriage records proved immediately puzzling. According to the county clerk's files, 3 women named Esperanza, Dolores, and Caridad Calderón had all married a man named Vicente Calderón Jr. on the same date in June 1912. The ceremony had been performed by a traveling minister whose credentials seemed questionable, and the witnesses listed were individuals whose names appeared nowhere else in the county's records. Thomas studied the marriage certificates carefully, noting several irregularities that suggested possible fraud or at least highly unusual circumstances. The signatures appeared to be written by the same hand despite supposedly representing different individuals, and the dates had been altered in ways that suggested deliberate falsification. Most troubling was the fact that all 3 brides shared the same surname as their supposed husband, indicating either coincidence or family relationships that made their marriages legally problematic. Property records dating back to the 1890s showed continuous Calderón ownership of the isolated homestead, with deeds passing from Vicente Calderón Sr. to his son Vicente Jr. In 1915, the inheritance patterns suggested a family determined to maintain control over their land through generations, though the legal mechanisms used to achieve this control appeared unconventional by normal standards. Birth certificates presented an even more confusing picture. The county had recorded dozens of children bearing the Calderón surname over the past 2 decades, but the documentation was incomplete and often contradictory. Many certificates listed mothers but left the father's name blank, while others showed impossible relationships between parents and children based on the ages recorded. Thomas consulted baptismal records from the local Catholic Church, hoping to find more reliable information about the family's composition and history. Father McKenna, the elderly priest who had served the mountain parishes for over 30 years, proved reluctant to discuss the Calderón family, but eventually provided access to his carefully maintained records. Unusual family, Father McKenna observed, watching Thomas examine the baptismal certificates. I've baptized many of their children over the years, though they rarely attend regular services. The family seems to interpret Catholic doctrine in their own particular way. The church records confirmed the birth of numerous Calderón children, but raised additional questions about the family's structure and relationships. Father McKenna's notes indicated concerns about the family's religious practices and their interpretation of biblical teachings regarding marriage and family obligations, though he remained diplomatically vague about the specific nature of these concerns. Meanwhile, Dr. Hayes had begun her own investigation into the medical history of the unusual children she had encountered. Her inquiries at the county health office revealed a disturbing pattern of infant mortality and birth defects concentrated in the remote northern valley where the Calderón homestead was located. Official health records showed far higher rates of stillbirths, infant deaths, and developmental abnormalities in that specific geographic area than in surrounding regions. The county health officer, Dr. William Patterson, had worked in the area for 15 years and was familiar with the challenges facing isolated mountain communities. When Dr. Hayes showed him her notes about the genetically similar children she had examined, his expression grew troubled. "I've suspected something unusual was happening up in that valley," Dr. Patterson admitted. "We get called occasionally for death certificates, always for infants who supposedly died of natural causes. But the frequency is far higher than normal, and the families are always evasive about the circumstances." Dr. Patterson retrieved a file containing death certificates from the Northern Valley region. The records showed an alarming pattern of infant and child mortality spanning several decades, with most deaths attributed to genetic disorders, developmental abnormalities, or failure to thrive. The concentration of such problems in a single family line suggested either environmental factors affecting the entire valley or genetic issues resulting from intermarriage within a small population. "Have you ever visited the homestead directly?" Dr. Hayes asked, studying the mortality statistics. "Once, about 10 years ago," Dr. Patterson replied. "I was called to certify the death of an infant, but the family wouldn't let me examine the body properly. They had already prepared it for burial according to their own customs, and seemed anxious to complete the process as quickly as possible." He described an atmosphere of secretiveness and fear that had made his professional duties difficult to fulfill. The family members he encountered seemed terrified of outside medical intervention and insisted on handling all health matters through their own traditional methods. Most disturbing was the number of children he glimpsed during his brief visit, far more than seemed possible given the household's known composition. Thomas and Dr. Hayes arranged to meet at the general store the following afternoon to compare their findings. The storekeeper, initially reluctant to discuss the Calderón family, gradually became more forthcoming as he realized the seriousness of the investigation. "They've been customers here longer than I've owned this store," he explained. "Always polite, always pay in cash or old silver, but never social. The woman who comes for supplies, she's been doing it for 20 years or more, and she looks exactly the same as when she started. It's like time don't touch that family." The storekeeper's records showed consistent large quantity purchases that supported a household much larger than 3 adult women. Monthly orders included substantial amounts of children's clothing, medical supplies, and food quantities that suggested feeding a dozen or more individuals on a regular basis. As Thomas and Dr. Hayes compiled their evidence, a picture began to emerge of a family living in complete isolation while concealing the true nature of their household composition and the troubling pattern of genetic problems affecting their children. The collaboration between Thomas Chen and Dr. Margaret Hayes had evolved from professional curiosity into genuine concern for the welfare of the children they suspected were living in dangerous conditions at the Calderón homestead. Their separate investigations had revealed a pattern of deception and medical neglect that demanded immediate attention, though the family's extreme isolation made direct intervention challenging. Thomas arranged to borrow surveying equipment from the county offices, ostensibly to complete mapping work in the remote northern valley. The aerial survey photographs he obtained from the State Forestry Service revealed details about the Calderón property that had previously been hidden from outside observation. The homestead was far larger and more complex than anyone had imagined, with multiple residential buildings, extensive agricultural facilities, and a cemetery that appeared to contain far more graves than would be expected for a normal family. The photographs showed evidence of recent construction and ongoing maintenance that contradicted the family's reputation for complete isolation. Gardens, livestock areas, and what appeared to be workshop facilities suggested a self-sufficient community rather than a simple farm household. Most intriguingly, the images revealed paths and structures that indicated a population much larger than the 3 adult women who represented the family in public. Dr. Hayes, meanwhile, had made contact with a former social worker named Eleanor Ross, who had attempted to visit the Calderón homestead during her tenure with the State Welfare Department in the mid-1920s. Eleanor, now retired and living in Charleston, agreed to meet with Dr. Hayes to discuss her disturbing memories of that long-ago encounter. "It was 1924, I believe," Eleanor recalled, her voice still carrying traces of the unease she had felt decades earlier. "We had received reports about children in the northern mountains who might be in need of services, though the reports were always vague and second-hand." Eleanor described her journey to the isolated homestead, accompanied by a local sheriff's deputy who had been reluctant to make the trip. The family had eventually allowed them onto the property after lengthy negotiations conducted through the locked gate, but their visit had been carefully supervised and limited to specific areas of the main house. "What I saw troubled me greatly," Eleanor continued. "There were far too many children for the household composition we had been told about. The children seemed fearful and withdrawn, and many showed signs of malnutrition and medical neglect. Most concerning was their apparent lack of education or socialization with anyone outside their immediate family." The social worker had attempted to conduct interviews with individual children to assess their welfare, but the family had insisted that all conversations be conducted in the presence of adult family members. The children seemed coached in their responses and appeared terrified of saying anything that might displease their supervisors. "I tried to return several times over the following months," Eleanor explained, "but the family had obviously been warned about my intentions. They refused all further contact and threatened legal action if we continued to trespass on their private property." Eleanor's written reports from that period, which she had preserved in her personal files, documented her suspicions about the family's living arrangements and her concerns about the children's welfare. Her professional assessment suggested systematic abuse and neglect, though she had been unable to gather sufficient evidence to justify legal intervention under the limited child protection laws of the 1920s. Thomas and Dr. Hayes studied Eleanor's reports with growing alarm. Her observations confirmed their worst fears about the conditions at the Calderón homestead and provided historical context for the pattern of problems they had identified. The situation had apparently been deteriorating for decades, while local and state authorities turned a blind eye to warning signs that should have prompted investigation. Their research into the homestead's history revealed additional disturbing details. Property surveys from the 1890s showed that the original Vicente Calderón had deliberately chosen the most isolated location possible for his family's settlement, purchasing land in a valley with limited access routes and natural barriers to outside contact. Subsequent land acquisitions had expanded the family's holdings, while further reducing the possibility of outside interference. County road maintenance records showed a curious pattern regarding the mountain paths leading to the Calderón property. Bridges connecting their valley to other settlements had been damaged by floods or accidents on multiple occasions, but repairs had been consistently delayed or abandoned entirely. Local residents reported that the family seemed to prefer the isolation created by these transportation barriers and had never petitioned for improved access to their homestead. The investigation also uncovered evidence of the family's systematic efforts to avoid outside contact and official scrutiny. Tax records showed that they had consistently paid all obligations promptly and in full, presumably to avoid any reason for government officials to visit their property. Legal documents revealed that they had retained lawyers in Charleston to handle any potential conflicts with local authorities, though these legal representatives had never visited the homestead directly. Most troubling was the discovery that several government officials and medical professionals had attempted to investigate the family's circumstances over the years, but their efforts had been consistently thwarted by legal challenges, jurisdictional disputes, or simply the practical difficulties of reaching the remote location. A pattern emerged of concerned individuals being discouraged, transferred, or otherwise prevented from pursuing their investigations to completion. The mounting evidence convinced Thomas and Dr. Hayes that they were dealing with a situation far more serious than simple record-keeping irregularities or medical neglect. The systematic isolation, the evidence of multiple generations of genetic problems, and the family's desperate efforts to avoid outside contact suggested a deliberate conspiracy to conceal activities that would not withstand public scrutiny. As winter approached, and weather conditions would soon make travel to the remote homestead even more difficult, they realized that immediate action was necessary to protect the children they suspected were suffering in isolation. The opportunity for direct investigation came sooner than Thomas had expected. His careful observation of the family's routines had revealed that the Calderón women made their monthly supply trip on the third Tuesday of each month, leaving the homestead unattended for several hours while they traveled to Cedar Grove and back. On November 15, 1932, Thomas positioned himself on a ridge overlooking the mountain road and confirmed that all three sisters had departed together in their wagon. Thomas approached the property with the caution of a man who understood he was potentially violating both legal boundaries and personal safety. The elaborate gate system that protected the main entrance appeared recently reinforced, but his survey of the property's perimeter had revealed several locations where the fencing was less substantial. He chose a spot where dense forest provided cover and where he could retreat quickly if discovered. The homestead's interior layout proved even more complex than the aerial photographs had suggested. Multiple buildings served different functions, from obvious residential structures to workshops, storage facilities, and what appeared to be isolated quarters that might house individuals being kept separate from the main household. The architecture throughout maintained the Spanish colonial style that characterized the main house, suggesting that all construction had been planned and executed according to a unified vision. Thomas's first objective was the main house, where family records and personal documents would most likely be stored. The building's interior reflected the same careful planning evident in its exterior, with rooms arranged to accommodate a large household while maintaining privacy between different family groups. What struck him most forcefully was the evidence of multiple generations living together in ways that seemed designed to minimize contact with the outside world. Children's belongings were scattered throughout the house in quantities that confirmed his suspicions about the family's true size. Clothing, toys, and educational materials suggested the presence of young people ranging from infants to teenagers. though the items showed signs of heavy use and poor maintenance that indicated economic hardship or deliberate neglect of the children's basic needs. In what appeared to be the main office or study, Thomas discovered a locked cabinet containing family documents that would prove crucial to understanding the Calderón situation. The lock was substantial, but not beyond his ability to overcome with tools he had brought for the purpose. Inside, he found a collection of journals, photographs, legal documents, and correspondence that revealed the true scope of the family's deception. Vicente Calderón Sr.'s personal journals, written in a mixture of Spanish and English, documented his philosophy regarding family purity and his systematic efforts to create what he considered a superior bloodline through careful breeding practices. The entries, spanning several decades, revealed a man obsessed with maintaining genetic isolation while avoiding the scrutiny of outside authorities who might interfere with his plans. The journal entries described Vicente's marriage to his own daughters as a religious obligation designed to preserve the family's Spanish heritage and prevent contamination of their bloodline by outsiders. He had developed elaborate justifications for these relationships based on his interpretation of biblical genealogies and Spanish colonial marriage practices, though his reasoning clearly reflected psychological dysfunction rather than legitimate religious belief. Photographs stored with the journals provided visual documentation of the family's composition over several generations. Images from the early 1900s showed Vicente Sr. with his first wife and their daughters, while later photographs revealed the complex family structure that had developed as those daughters became his wives and bore children who were simultaneously his offspring and his grandchildren. The most recent photographs, apparently taken within the past few years, showed the devastating effects of multiple generations of inbreeding on the family's children. Many displayed the severe physical abnormalities that Dr. Hayes had documented in her medical examinations, while others showed developmental delays and health problems that would require specialized care to address properly. Legal documents in the cabinet revealed the extent of Vicente's efforts to legitimize his family structure through forged marriage certificates, falsified birth records, and corrupted official documentation. He had systematically bribed local officials, intimidated potential witnesses, and created a network of legal protection designed to prevent outside investigation of his household's composition and activities. Correspondence with lawyers in Charleston showed that Vicente had retained legal counsel specifically to defend against potential charges related to his marriage practices and child-rearing methods. The lawyers' responses indicated their discomfort with representing the family, though they had apparently been paid enough to overlook their ethical concerns about the situation. Most disturbing were Vicente's detailed breeding records, which documented his systematic approach to producing children with specific genetic characteristics, while attempting to minimize the negative effects of inbreeding. He had maintained careful genealogies tracking which family members had produced the healthiest offspring, and had planned future relationships accordingly, treating his children and grandchildren as breeding stock rather than human beings deserving of care and protection. The records also revealed that Vicente Sr. had died approximately 5 years earlier, but his eldest son, who had assumed the name Vicente Jr., had continued the family's practices under his father's established system. The current household was being maintained by this second-generation Vicente, who had inherited not only his father's property and wealth, but also his obsessions with genetic purity and family isolation. As Thomas photographed the most crucial documents and prepared to leave the property before the sisters returned, he realized that he had uncovered evidence of a systematic pattern of abuse spanning multiple generations. The Calderón family represented not simply a case of unusual marriage customs or isolated living conditions, but a deliberate conspiracy to maintain illegal relationships while concealing the resulting harm to innocent children who had no choice in their circumstances. The weight of his discoveries convinced Thomas that immediate intervention was essential to to protect the children currently living under these conditions, and to prevent the continuation of practices that had already caused immeasurable suffering. Thomas Chen and Dr. Margaret Hayes met with Sheriff William Morrison in his cramped office above the Cedar Grove General Store on a cold November morning that would change the course of the Calderón investigation forever. The evidence they had compiled over weeks of careful research filled 2 large folders, and the photographs Thomas had obtained during his unauthorized visit to the homestead provided visual confirmation of their worst suspicions. Sheriff Morrison, a practical man who had served the mountain communities for over 15 years, initially showed the skepticism of someone who had heard countless rumors and wild stories about the isolated families in his jurisdiction. His expression grew increasingly troubled, however, as Thomas and Dr. Hayes presented their systematic documentation of the family's deception and the medical evidence of systematic abuse spanning multiple generations. "This is the most disturbing case I've encountered in my entire career," Sheriff Morrison admitted, studying the photographs of children showing clear signs of genetic disorders resulting from inbreeding. "If these allegations are accurate, we're dealing with criminal activity that has been ongoing for decades while the entire community chose to look the other way." The legal challenges were substantial. The Calderón family's property lay in an isolated location that made law enforcement visits difficult under normal circumstances, and their history of legal resistance suggested that any official intervention would be met with sophisticated opposition. More problematically, the family had maintained technical compliance with most local regulations, while concealing the true nature of their household composition and child-rearing practices. Dr. Hayes presented her medical findings with the clinical precision that had made her reputation throughout the region. Her documentation of genetic disorders, developmental delays, and systematic medical neglect provided compelling evidence that children were suffering serious harm while being denied access to appropriate health care and education. "These children require immediate medical intervention," Dr. Hayes explained, showing Sheriff Morrison her detailed patient notes. "The genetic damage resulting from multiple generations of inbreeding has created conditions that will only worsen without proper treatment. Some of the developmental delays might be partially reversible with appropriate therapy, but time is crucial." Sheriff Morrison contacted the state authorities in Charleston, explaining the situation to officials who had the legal authority and resources necessary to conduct a proper investigation of the isolated homestead. The response was immediate and decisive. A team of social workers, medical personnel, and law enforcement officers would be assembled to conduct a welfare check on the children suspected of living in dangerous conditions. The official intervention was scheduled for the following Wednesday, when the family's normal routines would make them least prepared to resist outside interference. Sheriff Morrison would lead the local contingent, while state officials would provide legal authority and specialized expertise in handling cases involving child endangerment and family dysfunction. Thomas and Dr. Hayes were designated as key witnesses, who would accompany the official team to provide context and expertise based on their extensive research into the family's history and current circumstances. Their documentation would serve as the foundation for whatever legal proceedings might result from the investigation. On the morning of the intervention, the convoy of official vehicles made its way slowly up the treacherous mountain road leading to the Calderón homestead. The November weather had turned bitter cold, and patches of ice made the journey even more hazardous than usual. The isolation that had protected the family's secrets for so many years now worked against them, as the same geographic barriers that had prevented outside interference also made it impossible for them to escape official scrutiny once authorities were determined to investigate. The elaborate gate system that had intimidated previous visitors proved ineffective against a coordinated law enforcement operation, equipped with proper tools and legal authority. Sheriff Morrison presented the official warrant to the family representatives who emerged from the main house, while social workers and medical personnel prepared to conduct comprehensive examinations of the property and its residents. Esperanza Calderón, serving as the family's spokesperson, attempted to invoke their constitutional rights to privacy and religious freedom, but her arguments carried little weight against the documented evidence of child endangerment and medical neglect. The family's decades of careful legal preparation had not anticipated the coordinated response of multiple government agencies working together to protect the welfare of vulnerable children. The initial survey of the property confirmed the investigators' worst fears about the living conditions and family composition. Children of various ages emerged from different buildings throughout the homestead, many showing obvious signs of malnutrition, medical problems, and developmental delays that had gone untreated for years. The total number of residents far exceeded any previous official count, and the complex family relationships became immediately apparent to trained social workers familiar with signs of systematic abuse. Dr. Hayes began conducting preliminary medical examinations, while social workers interviewed children to assess their educational level, psychological condition, and understanding of their family circumstances. The results were heartbreaking. Most of the children had never attended school, had minimal contact with anyone outside their immediate family, and showed clear evidence of psychological trauma resulting from their isolated and controlled upbringing. Vicente Calderón Jr., the current head of household, initially attempted to maintain the family's traditional stance of cooperation with authorities while protecting their privacy. As the scope of the investigation became clear, however, his demeanor shifted to barely controlled panic as he realized that decades of carefully maintained deception were collapsing in a single afternoon. The confrontation that Thomas and Dr. Hayes had anticipated became inevitable when investigators discovered Vicente's private study and the detailed records documenting the family's breeding practices and systematic approach to maintaining genetic isolation through incestuous relationships spanning multiple generations. The full scope of the Calderón family's systematic deception became horrifyingly clear as investigators methodically documented the evidence contained within Vicente Jr.'s private study. The room, locked away from the main household areas, served as both archive and planning center for a multi-generational conspiracy that had produced decades of human suffering while maintaining a facade of respectability and legal compliance. Vicente Sr.'s original journals, dating back to the 1890s, revealed the philosophical foundations of the family's practices. His writings demonstrated a profound misunderstanding of genetics, religion, and human relationships, twisted into a coherent but deeply disturbed worldview that justified systematic abuse as a form of divine obligation. His obsession with maintaining what he called bloodline purity had evolved from eccentric beliefs about Spanish nobility into a comprehensive system for controlling every aspect of his family's reproductive choices. The genealogical charts that covered entire walls of the study mapped 3 generations of carefully planned incestuous relationships. Vicente Sr. had begun the pattern by marrying his own daughters after his first wife's death, justifying these relationships through selective quotations from biblical texts and distorted interpretations of Spanish colonial marriage customs. The charts showed how each subsequent generation had been systematically bred according to his theories about genetic superiority and racial purity. Most disturbing was the clinical detachment with which Vicente Sr. had documented the results of his breeding program. Medical records showed that he had carefully tracked which family combinations produced the healthiest children, and which resulted in severe genetic abnormalities or early death. Children who failed to meet his standards were isolated from the rest of the family, and often died in infancy under circumstances that had never been properly investigated by outside authorities. The current generation's circumstances proved even more troubling than the historical evidence. Vicent Jr., despite being a product of his father's systematic abuse, had internalized the family's twisted ideology completely and continued the practices with religious fervor. His own detailed record showed ongoing relationships with his sisters and nieces, justified through the same distorted reasoning that had motivated his father's actions decades earlier. Social worker Mary Patterson, who had specialized in cases of family dysfunction throughout her career, found herself overwhelmed by the psychological damage evident in the children she interviewed. Most had never attended school, had limited vocabulary, and showed clear signs of developmental delays that resulted from both genetic factors and systematic educational neglect. More troubling was their apparent acceptance of family relationships that any normal child would recognize as deeply wrong. These children have been completely isolated from normal human society, Mary explained to her colleagues during a brief conference outside the main house. They have no understanding that their family structure is abnormal or harmful. Some of the older children actually defend their circumstances and express fear about being separated from the only environment they have ever known. Dr. Hayes conducted comprehensive medical examinations that confirmed the genetic damage resulting from multiple generations of inbreeding. 15 children currently lived on the property, ranging in age from infants to teenagers, and all showed some degree of physical or mental abnormality. The most severely affected children required immediate medical intervention to address conditions that had gone untreated for years, while others might benefit from educational and therapeutic programs designed to help them develop normal social skills. The family cemetery, which investigators examined with mounting horror, contained evidence of the true cost of Vicent Sr.'s breeding experiments. Dozens of unmarked graves held the remains of infants and children who had not survived their genetic abnormalities, while careful records in the family archives documented which family combinations had proved most lethal to their offspring. The systematic nature of these deaths, combined with the family's deliberate concealment of infant mortality rates, suggested criminal negligence at minimum and potentially more serious charges. Vicent Jr.'s attempts to justify his family's practices revealed the depth of psychological distortion that had developed over decades of isolation and systematic abuse. During questioning by authorities, he insisted that his family was preserving something sacred and important that outsiders could not understand. His religious justifications, while clearly delusional, demonstrated sincere belief in the righteousness of his actions, making him both perpetrator and victim of the system his father had created. "We are the guardians of pure blood," Vicent Jr. explained to skeptical investigators, showing no recognition of the horror his words conveyed. "My father taught us that mixing with outsiders would destroy everything our family has preserved for generations. These children are blessed, not cursed. They carry the essence of our ancestors without contamination from inferior bloodlines." The three sisters, when finally separated from Vicent Jr.'s influence and interviewed individually, revealed the complex psychology of victims who had become perpetrators of the same abuse they had suffered. Esperanza, the eldest, showed the most awareness that their family's practices were viewed as wrong by outside society, but she remained convinced that protecting the family's secrets was her primary obligation. Dolores, the middle sister, appeared to be suffering from severe mental illness that had gone untreated for decades. Her responses to questions were often incoherent, and she showed signs of dissociation and psychological trauma that required immediate psychiatric intervention. Her condition suggested that the psychological damage inflicted by the family's practices extended far beyond the children, to include the adult women who had been forced to participate in maintaining the system. Caridad, the youngest sister at 28, provided the most coherent account of the family's internal dynamics and the systematic control that had prevented any family member from seeking outside help or escaping their circumstances. Her testimony revealed the extent to which fear, religious indoctrination, and economic dependence had trapped multiple generations in a cycle of abuse that had seemed impossible to break from within. The immediate aftermath of the official intervention at the Calderón homestead required coordinated efforts from multiple state agencies to address the complex medical, legal, and social challenges presented by 15 children who had been systematically isolated from normal society for their entire lives. Emergency medical transport vehicles arrived from Charleston to evacuate the most seriously affected children to specialized facilities, equipped to handle their unique combination of genetic disorders and psychological trauma. Dr. Hayes worked tirelessly to prioritize medical needs as children were prepared for transport to various treatment facilities throughout the state. The youngest victims, including several infants showing severe developmental abnormalities, required immediate intensive care to address life-threatening conditions that had received no proper medical attention. Older children with less critical physical problems still needed comprehensive evaluations to determine the extent of their educational and psychological deficits. The legal proceedings against the adult family members began within days of the discovery, though prosecutors faced unusual challenges in determining appropriate charges for crimes that had been ongoing for decades, while remaining technically legal under the family's carefully constructed documentation. Vicent Jr. was charged with child endangerment, educational neglect, and falsifying official documents, while the three sisters faced charges related to their participation in concealing the family's illegal activities from authorities. State social worker Margaret Collins, who had been assigned to coordinate the children's placement and care, found herself dealing with victims unlike any she had encountered in 20 years of child welfare work. The children's complete lack of exposure to normal social relationships, combined with their psychological attachment to family members who had systematically abused them, created complex emotional challenges that required specialized therapeutic approaches. These children have never attended school, never played with other children their age, and never lived anywhere except this isolated homestead. Collins explained to the team of psychologists and educators who would be responsible for their rehabilitation. Some of them are terrified of being separated from the only family they have ever known, even though that family has caused them tremendous harm. The older children, particularly those in their teens, showed the most resistance to outside intervention and expressed genuine belief that their family's way of life was morally superior to normal society. Years of religious indoctrination had convinced them that outsiders were spiritually contaminated and that their isolation had protected them from corruption. Breaking through this psychological conditioning would require patient therapeutic work designed to help them understand normal human relationships without traumatizing them further. Medical facilities throughout West Virginia and neighboring states were contacted to provide specialized care for children whose genetic conditions required treatment by experts in hereditary disorders. The University of Pittsburgh Medical Center agreed to accept several of the most severely affected children, while other specialized institutions offered services for those with developmental delays and psychological trauma resulting from their isolated upbringing. Dr. Hayes established a comprehensive medical documentation project to create detailed records of each child's condition and treatment needs. Her work would serve not only to guide their immediate care, but also to provide scientific data about the effects of systematic inbreeding on human populations. The medical establishment had few documented cases of multi-generational incest involving such a large family group, making the Calderón situation valuable for research purposes, while remaining primarily focused on the children's welfare. The financial costs of providing appropriate care for 15 traumatized children with complex medical and educational needs quickly exceeded the resources of local agencies, requiring state-level funding and coordination with private charitable organizations. The case attracted attention from medical researchers, social workers, and legal experts who recognized its significance for understanding and preventing similar situations in other isolated communities. Vicent Jr.'s psychological evaluation revealed a complex individual who genuinely believed his family's practices were morally justified, while showing no understanding of the harm he had caused to innocent children. His religious delusions, combined with decades of social isolation, had created a worldview so distorted that conventional therapeutic approaches proved largely ineffective. Mental health professionals determined that he posed an ongoing danger to children and recommended indefinite institutional care. The three sisters presented different psychological profiles that reflected their individual responses to decades of systematic abuse and control. Esperanza showed signs of depression and anxiety, but retained enough connection to reality to understand that their family's practices were viewed as harmful by outside society. Her cooperation with authorities suggested the possibility of successful rehabilitation and eventual reintegration into normal society. Dolar's severe mental illness required immediate psychiatric hospitalization, as her dissociative episodes and incoherent responses indicated psychological damage that might never be fully repaired. Her condition served as a stark reminder of the psychological costs inflicted by the family's systematic abuse of multiple generations of victims who had no choice in their circumstances. Caridad, despite being the youngest sister, provided the most valuable testimony about the family's internal dynamics and the systematic control mechanisms that had prevented anyone from seeking outside help. Her detailed descriptions of daily life at the homestead revealed how fear, religious indoctrination, and economic dependence had created a closed system that perpetuated abuse across generations, while maintaining external appearances of respectability. The legal proceedings attracted media attention from regional newspapers, though authorities worked carefully to protect the privacy of the children, while ensuring that the public understood the seriousness of the crimes that had been committed. The case highlighted the dangers of extreme isolation and the importance of government oversight in protecting vulnerable individuals who might be suffering abuse in remote locations beyond normal social contact. Community leaders in Cedar Grove and surrounding areas faced difficult questions about their collective failure to investigate obvious warning signs that had been apparent for decades. The systematic denial and willful ignorance that had allowed the Calderón family to continue their harmful practices, undetected, required serious examination of how similar situations might be prevented in the future. 2 years after the discovery at the Calderón homestead, the mountain valley that had hidden decades of systematic abuse had been transformed into state-protected woodland, ensuring that the cycle of generational trauma would never resume in that location. The buildings that had housed 3 generations of victims and perpetrators were demolished in the spring of 1934, their materials donated to families throughout the region who were struggling through the ongoing economic hardship of the Great Depression. The 15 children rescued from the homestead had been placed in carefully selected foster homes and specialized care facilities throughout West Virginia and neighboring states, with their progress monitored by a dedicated team of social workers, medical professionals, and educators who understood the unique challenges they faced. Dr. Margaret Hayes had accepted a position with the State Health Department, specifically to oversee their care and ensure that they received the comprehensive support necessary for successful integration into normal society. The youngest children, those under the age of 5, showed remarkable resilience in adapting to normal family environments when placed with patient and understanding foster families. Their genetic conditions required ongoing medical attention, but most were able to develop age-appropriate social skills and educational progress when provided with proper care and stimulation. The success of these placements provided hope that the damage inflicted by their early circumstances might be at least partially overcome through dedicated intervention. Older children faced more significant challenges in adjusting to life outside their isolated family system. Several teenagers required residential treatment facilities, equipped to address both their medical needs and their psychological resistance to normal social relationships. Their deeply ingrained beliefs about family loyalty and religious obligation made therapeutic progress slow and often frustrating, but dedicated professionals achieved gradual success in helping them understand healthier ways of relating to others. Thomas Chen had used his documentation of the Calderón case to advocate for systematic reforms in census procedures and rural social services. His detailed investigation had demonstrated how isolated families could avoid official scrutiny for decades by manipulating legal systems and exploiting the practical difficulties of monitoring remote populations. The federal government implemented new protocols requiring regular welfare checks on households showing unusual population patterns or suspicious record-keeping practices. Dr. Hayes established the Mountain Community Health Initiative, a program designed to provide regular medical care to isolated families throughout Appalachia, while training local healthcare workers to recognize signs of systematic abuse or neglect. Her comprehensive study of the genetic effects of inbreeding, based on her treatment of the Calderón children, became a landmark reference for medical professionals dealing with similar cases in other rural communities. The legal proceedings against the adult family members concluded with sentences that reflected both the severity of their crimes and their status as victims of the same system they had perpetuated. Vicent Jr. received life imprisonment in a state psychiatric facility, where he continued to express no remorse for his actions while showing no understanding of the harm he had caused. His psychological evaluation indicated that his religious delusions were so deeply entrenched that rehabilitation was considered impossible. Esperanza Calderón was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but became eligible for parole after serving 8 years due to her cooperation with authorities and her participation in psychological treatment programs. Her gradual recognition that the family's practices had been harmful to innocent children suggested the possibility of eventual rehabilitation, though she would require continued supervision and therapy to prevent any future risk to vulnerable individuals. Dollars remained in psychiatric care indefinitely, her severe mental illness requiring specialized treatment that might continue for the remainder of her life. Her condition served as a powerful reminder of how systematic abuse could destroy not only its immediate victims, but also those forced to participate in perpetuating harmful practices across multiple generations. Caridad's cooperation with investigators and her detailed testimony about the family's internal dynamics had contributed significantly to understanding how such systematic abuse could continue undetected for so many years. Her sentence of 10 years with the possibility of early parole reflected both her culpability and her status as a victim who had been indoctrinated from childhood into accepting abnormal family relationships as morally justified. The Calderón case became a catalyst for broader social reforms designed to protect isolated rural populations from similar abuse. New laws required mandatory reporting of suspicious family situations by healthcare workers, educators, and social service providers, while government agencies developed protocols for investigating families that showed patterns of isolation and record-keeping irregularities. Educational initiatives were established to help rural communities recognize warning signs of family dysfunction and understand their obligations to protect vulnerable children from systematic abuse. The case highlighted how community silence and willful ignorance could enable horrible crimes to continue undetected, while innocent victims suffered without hope of rescue or relief. Professional training programs for social workers, healthcare providers, and law enforcement officers incorporated lessons learned from the Calderón investigation to improve recognition and response to complex family abuse situations. The systematic nature of the crimes and the sophisticated methods used to avoid detection required new approaches to protecting children in isolated communities, where traditional oversight mechanisms might prove inadequate. The mountain valley, where the Calderón homestead once stood, became a symbol of transformation and healing, its reforestation representing the possibility of recovery from even the most devastating forms of human cruelty. Visitors to the area found only hiking trails and wildlife habitats, with no remaining evidence of the suffering that had occurred there for nearly half a century. The children who survived the Calderón tragedy grew into adulthood with varying degrees of success in overcoming their traumatic origins. Some achieved remarkable progress in education and social development, while others continued to struggle with the psychological and medical consequences of their early experiences. Their resilience and the dedication of those who helped them heal demonstrated that even the most systematic abuse could be overcome through patient care and unwavering commitment to human dignity and justice.